For what purposes does the gentlewoman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2117.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 563 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House of the Committee on the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 2117. The Chair appoints the gentlewoman from Michigan, Mrs. Miller, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2117, which the Clerk will report by title.
A bill to prohibit the Department of Education from overreaching into academic affairs and program eligibility under Title IV of the Higher Education Act of 1965.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time, and the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Klein, and the gentleman from California, Mr. George Miller, who each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The House is not in order.
Lady is correct. The House will come to order. The House will be in order. The committee will be in order. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the recognition. I would now like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from Minnesota and Chairman of the House Education Workforce Committee, Mr. Klein, for such time as he may consume.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for as much time as he may consume. The gentleman will suspend just a moment. The committee is not in order. The committee will be in order. Members are advised to take their comments off the floor. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the gentlelady, Ms. Foxx, for yielding the time. I rise in support of H.R. 2117, the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act. The legislation before us today is driven by a simple goal: to ensure Washington isn't adding to the burden of rising college costs by imposing burdensome regulations. Last year, tuition and fees at public four-year colleges and universities increased over 8%. The average four-year public college student now graduates with roughly $22,000 of debt. Helping more students realize the dream of an affordable higher education is a shared goal. However, solving a problem like rising college costs starts with recognizing that, as is so often the case, Washington is part of the problem. Each year, Madam Chair, the committee.
Gentleman is correct. Gentleman will suspend. The committee will come to order. Members are advised to take their conversations from the floor. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Each year, the average higher education institution spends a significant amount of time and money complying with federal regulations and reporting requirements, costs that can trickle down to students' tuitions and fees. H.R. 2117 will eliminate 2 unnecessarily burdensome regulations advanced by the Department of Education in late 2010. The credit hour and state authorization regulations were part of a so-called program integrity package that significantly increased federal intrusion in academic affairs. The credit hour regulation attempts to measure student learning at the federal level and restricts colleges from offering outside coursework and creative learning opportunities that could help students save money and graduate early. The state authorization regulation is even more troubling, as it will lead to thousands of dollars in additional costs for colleges and universities across the nation. In my home state of Minnesota, schools must spend between $2,000 and $3,500 per program depending upon the level of degree offered, to comply with this extreme regulation. In order to best prepare today's students to join tomorrow's workforce, we must not overwhelm schools with poorly conceived regulations that lead to wasted time and money. H.R. 2117 will repeal two particularly problematic regulations protecting academic institutions and prospective students from significant financial and bureaucratic burdens. Madam Chair, I urge my colleagues to support the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
Chair, I yield myself 5 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair and members of the House, we're now considering legislation that would significantly compromise the Department of Education's ability to oversee and safeguard our federal investment in higher education and to safeguard and protect the taxpayers who are paying for that investment in higher education. This legislation couldn't be more ill-timed. In this tough budget environment, we should be concerned with how the federal government spends the limited resources we dedicate to federal student aid. During 2009-2010 school year, students relied on nearly $200 billion in federal student aid to prepare for jobs for today and jobs for tomorrow. That's the money that they borrowed. That's the money that was given to them in grants. And if that money is not spent in a responsible way and if it is not protected, it goes down the drain, it's lost forever, and the students are left with the debt. 2 years ago, the Department of Education's Inspector General exposed a loophole that allowed higher education institutions to award more credits to get more student financial aid than was appropriate. They were charging for 9 units of aid that they said was graduate work. It turned out, when the accreditors went through and looked at it, they deemed it was really the equivalent of 3 hours of credit work, and it was the level of work was at the undergraduate level. But they were able to charge the student. The students had to borrow money, and then at the end of the day, they ended up with units that were worth nothing. Students attending this institution, many of whom were relying on federal aid programs, were paying double the price because the school inflated the number of credits charged. In response to the Inspector General's findings and recommendations, the Department of Education promulgated rules defining a credit hour and providing other protections for students, including ensuring students have access to a complaint process if there's fraud involved. What the Department of Education did was necessary, narrowly targeting to address a very costly problem. However, the bill before us today seeks to prevent the Department from protecting taxpayers and students. It would blow open the loophole that the Inspector General concluded led to the inappropriate federal spending. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the bill before us today explicitly increases the risk of fraud and waste and abuse in our federal student aid programs. At a time when the higher education market is in so much flux, with new kinds of programs popping up around the country and online, this is the wrong time to open this loophole against the taxpayer's best interest. The Department of Education should have tools to ensure that students who are eligible receive federal student aid for the purpose of which they are receiving, and the institutions that serve these programs are upholding the integrity of that program. This seems like a simple proposition, making sure taxpayers and students aren't getting ripped off. This legislation eliminates those important consumer protections, and it does so under the banner of academic freedom. But the Department's protection does not interfere with academic freedom. Colleges and universities will continue to be free under the Department's rules to set whatever higher standards they see fit for their students as long as the accreditors agree. In this economy, millions of students rely on federal student aid programs to make the dream of college degree a reality. This is exactly why the Department of Education has moved to ensure greater accountability and taxpayer protection. And it's exactly why the legislation is misguided. Now more than ever, we need accountability in higher education that works for the best interests of students and the federal aid programs. In the last Congress, Democrats worked to make sure that our student aid programs worked in the best interests of students, families, and taxpayers. We also worked hard to make higher education more accessible to families for whom degrees may be out of reach. One way we helped to make higher education more accessible and affordable and financially manageable for students and families was to lower the interest rates on loans. Specifically, we lowered the interest rates on needs-based students' loans to 3.4%, almost cutting the cost to those lenders in half, to those borrowers in half. The interest rate reduction is scheduled to end this summer. It will back bounce to where it was before the Democrats acted to reduce it. For the sake of our students and low rates, it should be extended. If Congress fails to act, interest rates on need-based student loans for more than 7 million students will double this July. This increase will cost an average borrower almost $2,800 in additional interest payments. At a time when the economy is so fragile footing and we shouldn't be building more hurdles to young people to get their education and the skills they need to succeed. And when interest rates are at a historic low, we should not be asking students to pay more on their student loan debt just because Congress failed to act. Earlier this month, Mr. Hinojosa and I asked our committee's majority to take immediate action on this important issue. The President has called for action as well. But just as other economic issues that are vitally important to the American people, those requests have been met with silence. So today, instead of saving students from interest rate hikes, we are here debating a bill that will take away the tools for the Department of Education needs to oversee and protect our investment in higher education, to protect those students who are borrowing money to go to college. I urge my colleagues to vote against this legislation. I urge the majority to take up a bill to make sure that interest rates don't double come July.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rowe.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise today in support of the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act, H.R. 2117. This bipartisan legislation will prevent the Department of Education from defining a college credit hour, something that is best left to our institutions of higher learning and their accrediting agencies. It will also block a cumbersome new rule that will require states to use federally set one-size-fits-all criteria to regulate higher education. If these two rules were allowed to go into effect, they would create tremendous new burdens and additional costs for students. The exploding cost of higher education is already putting the opportunity of a college education and diploma out of reach for too many Americans. Last year, tuition and fees at public four-year schools increased by 8.3%. More regulations will lead to more administrative staff and ultimately larger tuition bills. And I might add, Madam Chairman, that the fact that one institution or several institutions break the law, we have laws against robbing banks and people do that. There are unscrupulous people out there. But this is putting a burdensome regulation on the folks that are following the rules. The average debt of a college graduate today is approximately $22,000. When I went to medical school, I started in 1967 and graduated in 3 years in 1970. My father was a factory worker. I was able to work in medical school and graduate with no debt from college and medical school. That's unheard of today. Today, students are so far in debt that they'll spend up much of their working life paying off these exorbitant loans that they have. There is much that we can do to improve access to higher education and lower costs. Issuing new regulations, however, takes us in the opposite direction. I've taken hundreds of hours of college credit, and not one of them has been approved by the federal government. Yet I'm a board-certified physician. I think this goes way too far. Again, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back, Madam Chairman, the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hinojosa, the senior Democrat on the Higher Education Subcommittee.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Madam Chair, I rise today to express my opposition to H.R. 2117, the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act, misguided legislation that repeals efforts to protect students' and taxpayers' investment in higher education. Every year, the federal government spends billions of dollars on student financial aid, and we must account for these federal investments. As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Training, I am deeply concerned that H.R. 2117 would undermine the Secretary of Education's ability to oversee and safeguard our federal investment in higher ed. In my view, strong regulations strengthen the accountability and review of institutions of higher education that participate in federal student aid programs and help to maintain program integrity. In a globally competitive world, our students deserve to get what they paid for: high-quality educational programs that prepare them for the demands of the 21st century workforce and nothing less. H.R. 2117 repeals the U.S. Department of Education's credit hour regulation, which sets a minimum standard for the work needed to equal a credit hour for the purposes of federal student aid programs. To avoid having institutions overstate credit hours or inflate the federal student aid paid for students attending those programs, we must have consistent measures for credit hours. The credit hour definition provided by the Department is consistent with standard industry practice and provides needed flexibility for innovative programs. H.R. 2117 also repeals the requirement that higher ed institutions be legally authorized in the states they operate in, and that they have a process in place for handling student complaints when an institution fails to live up to its promises. Repealing this regulation is clearly unacceptable. Students need to be protected from unscrupulous actors. Most importantly, I am very disappointed that we are not using our time today to focus on making college more affordable. We must ensure that interest rates for need-based undergraduate student loans do not double from 3.4% to 6.8% in July of this year. If Congress fails to act, more than 7 million students will face approximately $2,800 in higher loan repayment costs. Now more than ever, American students need Congress's help to afford the cost of college education. In closing, I urge my colleagues to vote against H.R. 2117 because Congress and the Department of Education must provide strong oversight for federal student aid dollars and do everything possible to put students and taxpayers first and protect them from the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in our federal student aid programs. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
And I thank my friend, Mrs. Foxx, for yielding to me on this important issue. Madam Speaker, I rise today to voice my strong support for this important legislation, H.R. 2117. Recently, bureaucrats in the Department of Education promulgated a rule which would require institutions that offer distance education programs to meet state requirements in every state in which they have distant education students. This legislation that we have here would repeal that rule, a rule that negatively affects colleges and thousands of students around this country. But specifically in my district, I'm very proud that I have Central Texas College. Central Texas College may be the largest community college in the United States, possibly the world. It consistently has students of 75,000 plus every year. They provide both on-campus and distant education for thousands of American war fighters, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines around the world. These folks are in any place you can imagine are taking courses from Central Texas College. And they would be specifically impacted if the rule the bureaucrats have put upon us is not repealed. This is very important to the future of the educated warfighters. Under this rule, only colleges that maintain significant resource reserves would be able to comply with these state-authorized authorization requirements. But just let me point out, Central Texas College is a small public school doing great work for educating our soldiers around the world. We shouldn't let the bureaucrats in Washington take away the opportunity for an education for thousands of soldiers and other students that rely on distance education. This little school that sits on the edge of Fort Hood in Killeen, Texas, is educating soldiers around the world on shipboard and in military posts, and we need to make sure that this H.R. 2117 is passed to protect their education.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank my friend for yielding. First, let me say I agree with my friend from California that the highest priority in higher education ought to be avoiding that doubling of student loan rates this summer. We should get to work on that. Second, I rise in support of this bill, and let me tell you why. There is no question that avoiding fraudulent or wrongful credit hours is something we need to do. If someone pays for a credit hour, it ought to really be worth what they're paying for. And certainly if the federal taxpayers are paying for this through a Pell Grant or student loan, it certainly ought to be worth what we're paying for. The question is, who is best positioned to make that determination? For years in American higher education, we've had a system where a combination of institutions, their regional accrediting bodies, which are peer accreditors, and to some extent state governments, have decided the answer to that question. Without question, there have been some abuses. Without question, there have been some wrong answers. I don't think that those abuses or wrong answers justifies adding another layer of decision-making to the system, which would be the Department of Education. I certainly do think it is worth the attention of the committee and the Congress and the administration to think about ways to root out the bad practices that we have seen. But I think yet another level of rule making is the wrong way to go. The other objection that I would make to the rule is I think that we fall into a pattern here, particularly in higher education, where too few decisions are being made in a statutory way by this body and too many decisions are being made by the Department of Education through the regulatory process. As a result of these objections, a broad coalition of educators across the country is in support of this bill, and I am pleased to join that coalition and urge a yes vote on the bill here today. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I would like to thank Mr. Andrews for his pointing out that this is a very bipartisan bill supported by a coalition of many groups. I now would like to recognize my distinguished colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick.
For how much time?
Minutes. For 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2117, the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act. This important legislation aims to repeal 2 of the Department of Education's package of regulations that will hinder colleges and universities from making decisions that best serve their students. These federal regulations handed down from the Department of Education are not only proving to be costly, but they're intruding into areas best handled by academic institutions individually and also states. Today I urge my colleagues to join me in support of H.R. 2117 to repeal 2 regulations specifically that affect state authorization of academic institutions and the definition of credit hours. These provisions allow the federal government to reach further into the educational authority of the states. The state authorization provision requires institutions offering distance education programs to meet requirements in every state in which they have a distance education student. This regulation threatens programs like those offered by Penn State's World Campus and limit access to quality education. Many programs have already started to identify states where they will no longer be able to offer distance education. The credit hour provision establishes a federal definition of a credit hour, hindering institutions of higher education from making innovative and sensible core academic decisions related to their curriculum and imposing a one-size-fits-all approach. While I was home in Bucks County last week, Madam Chairman, I had the opportunity to meet with the president of a local college. He was worried specifically about the impact these burdensome regulations would have on his students, and more than 60 higher education associations and accrediting organizations have joined him in expressing their support for the repeal of these costly regulations. Over the course of the last decade, we've seen the cost of higher education skyrocket, with the rise in tuitions and fee at public four-year colleges and universities outpacing inflation by 5%. The rising cost of higher education will not be solved through more federal mandates and programs. We must return flexibility to academic institutions and prevent federal overreach into higher education by passing this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California. Where'd you go? Okay. To the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Chair, I thank my friend from California. And here I join the New Jersey President's Council, which represents all the institutions of higher education in New Jersey, in support of this legislation.
as well as the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in New Jersey, who support this bill, as well as the American Council on Education, which represents 1,600 college presidents around the country in support of this bill. Clearly, there have been abuses in some businesses and some institutions, and those abuses have to be addressed. But this legislation, I think, makes sure that we go about it in the right way. I'd like to quote from one of my constituents, President Shirley Tillman of Princeton University. She writes, quote, "Unlike many nations elsewhere in the world, the United States has nurtured a vibrant and vigorous respect for academic freedom. Under such a system, American higher education has flourished." She goes on, "But if recent trends continue, in which the staff at accrediting agencies, and I might add government agencies, seek to substitute their own judgments about what mission an institution should pursue and how that institution can best achieve that mission and measure success, we risk damaging the country's leading institutions." In other words, these are my words, the Department's rules strike at the heart of our excellent higher education. But whether these rules are in effect or not doesn't matter if students can't afford to go to college. My amendment to this legislation to require Pell Grants be maintained at least the current level of $5,500 was not made in order. Now, in New Jersey, 213,000 students use Pell Grants to make college affordable. There's bipartisan agreement on Mrs. Fox's bill, but unfortunately, this is a partisan matter. The Republicans in the House have may I request?
Seconds.
Thanks. The Republicans in the House have 3 times approved a budget that would slash the maximum Pell Grant to $3,040, the lowest since 1998. Slashing Pell Grants would put college out of reach for thousands of students. I call on the Republicans, because this is a partisan matter, to protect Pell Grants and not roll them back to their 1998 levels in their budget this year. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in support of H.R. 2117. Today's debate on the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act affords us a valuable opportunity to discuss challenges facing our higher education system. And I think that we all agree that we have a higher education system that's the envy of the world, and we all want to see it continue to enjoy the recognition that it enjoys now. But this also provides us an opportunity to show bipartisan support for the issue before us. I want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for understanding the danger to the higher education community that the regulations are presenting to us, and that they will stall the efforts in our country to make higher education more accessible and more affordable to everyone in the country. There's no denying the cost of college is skyrocketing. Last year, tuition and fees at public four-year colleges and universities increased 8.3%, even as inflation rose by only approximately 3%. In recent months, students and families have urged Congress to take action on the issue of rising college costs. The administration has proposed several programs and initiatives that they claim will reduce student loan debt and rein in tuition. However, these initiatives only further entrench the federal government in the affairs of states and institutions. Rather than getting the federal government more involved in higher education, we can start by working together to remove harmful regulations that pile unnecessary financial burdens on colleges and universities. The legislation before us today will eliminate 2 onerous regulations advanced by the Department of Education in October of 2010. The credit hour and state authorization regulations will restrict innovation, limit flexibility, and pave the way for additional federal overreach into higher education. The state authorization regulation sets federal requirements states must follow to grant colleges and universities permission to operate within the state. infringing on a state's ability to regulate in the way it chooses. For institutions that offer distance learning courses, this could mean meeting authorization requirements and paying authorization fees in all 50 states. One online university reports the state authorization regulation could cost the institution $700,000 initially, plus an additional $400,000 required annually. Faced with this astronomical sum, the university could be forced to pass these costs along to students in the form of higher tuition or new fees, or discontinue academic programs in some states. Either way, students will be the victims of this harmful regulation. Higher education officials are also crying foul over a regulation that establishes a federal definition of a credit hour. Last spring, Excelsior College President John Ebersole testified to the Subcommittee on Higher Education Workforce Training about this regulation, stating it inserts the Department of Education into academic judgments that should be made at the institution level and could destroy accelerated learning programs that allow students to complete their education more quickly. As a result, students will have fewer opportunities to graduate early with a smaller loan burden, and schools will have less incentive to offer creative courses that promote learning outside the classroom. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue to support this positive legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves her time. The gentleman from California.
You have 3 minutes. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank Mr. Miller for yielding. I rise in opposition to this legislation, and I'm going to focus my remarks on the credit hour piece of the legislation. Federal government has, the Department of Education has established a minimum standard for the credit hour. This as being derided as taking away institutional flexibility. It's being described as a federal overreach. It's being described as onerous. It's being described as dangerous. Let's read the regulation. The regulation says that a credit hour is an amount of work represented in intended learning outcomes and verified by evidence of student achievement that is, here's the part I want us to pay attention to, an institutionally established equivalency that reasonably approximates not less than 1 hour of classroom instruction for 15 weeks per credit hour. An institutionally established equivalency. That places the responsibility for determining what a credit hour is where it belongs, with the faculty and with the accreditor of that particular institution, so long as it complies with a minimum federal baseline or minimum federal standard. Now, with respect to overreach, with respect to how dangerous this is, with respect to how onerous this is, let's be clear. This very definition of a credit hour has been the law in the state of New York since 1976. We have some pretty good institutions in New York that have managed to survive even in the face of this so-called onerous regulation. Columbia University is one of the best universities in the world. So also is NYU. So also is Fordham. So also is Syracuse. This has been the law. I administered a school in the state of New York. Our cost of compliance for complying with the credit hour regulation was exactly zero. And we were able to create all kinds of innovative programs, a semester at sea, cooperative education, internships, truncated courses that met in accelerated time formats for 4 and 5 weeks, all because we established an institutional equivalency that was agreed to by our faculty and agreed to by our accreditors. That's all this regulation does. So for us to describe it as if it's going to end higher education as we know it and is going to stifle innovation and be onerous to students and add to the length of time for their degree programs, simply not true. We have a 35-year experience in New York that says that this regulation works just fine. Lastly, let me say, we define an academic year as consisting of 24 to 36 credit hours. That's what the federal government says. We say that you need to take at least 6 credit hours in order to be minimally eligible for financial aid, and yet we don't define the credit hour. So we base a great many of our judgments on what a credit hour is, yet we don't define it. let's vote against this regulation. Pardon me. Let's vote against this piece of legislation. Thank you very much.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd just like to point out very briefly to my colleague, Mr. Bishop, that institutions have always had the authority to do institutionally approved equivalency. It isn't something that we needed the federal government to give us. As a former assistant dean, I did that all the time, approved institutionally equivalents to courses. And so we've always had that approval. We didn't need the federal government to write it into rules and regulations. Madam Chairman, I now would like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina for yielding me the time, and not just for the time, but for her continued leadership on the floor of this House and in the halls of Congress. It's steady, it's dignified, it's common sense, and it's certainly a great reflection of the people she represents. I rise this afternoon to give my strong support to this measure. During this time of economic uncertainty and high unemployment, it is more important than ever, Madam Chair, to make sure the federal government does not stand in the way of Americans who wish to continue their education and gain the skills necessary for a more prosperous future. It's pretty simple. I believe a strong higher education system is critical to preparing American graduates for an increasingly competitive workforce. In Indiana, my students are not just competing with other students from Fort Wayne and Evansville. They're competing with students from places whose names we can barely pronounce all over the world, and that requires a different strategy. However, the regulatory initiatives put forth by the Department of Education will only add strain and undue burden on our colleges and universities. One of these regulations pertains to the authorization a college or university must attain from a state when operating within that state for institutions providing online education programs, which is becoming the new norm. This regulation could require them to obtain authorization in every state where enrolled students reside in order to participate in the federal student aid programs. This regulation will only serve to negatively impact states and institutions of higher education across the country and inject the federal government once again into an issue that is best left to the states and the post-secondary institutions themselves. I heard from many outstanding institutions in Indiana on this regulatory change. They are facing hundreds and potentially thousands of additional administrative hours just because they offer online programming. That is not fair. That is not American. Not only that, but if this rule goes into effect, they will likely deny entrance to students in states where they are not approved and deny financial aid to any current students living in those states as well. For that reason, I urge my colleagues, for all these reasons, I urge my colleagues to adopt this measure.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, we just spent the last few hours in an Education and Workforce Committee markup debating the disastrous Republican rewrite of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Not content to undermine K-12 education, the majority adjourned the markup so they could come down here and inflict damage on higher education as well. Through the repeal of these two important Department of Education regulations, H.R. 2117 undercuts college students' ability to be assured a quality education for their investment. Congresswoman Foxx's bill repeals 2 Department of Education regulations intended to protect consumers, students, and taxpayers, and the money that we invest in higher education, because it doesn't hold the spending accountable to ensure that there's real progress for the dollars that we invest. This bill doesn't do anything to solve the problem of how to make college more affordable for more people. Why are we doing this? Why aren't we addressing the absolutely looming student loan interest rate hike that will drastically increase the cost of college? If Congress doesn't act by July, more than 7 million students will face an increase of approximately $2,800 in higher costs. At a time when sluggish economy is making it hard for young people to find work, why aren't we standing here talking about cutting the barriers to higher education? Why aren't we opening a pathway to the American dream? Why are we restricting access to a college education? Why aren't we working for these kids instead of against them? I don't understand this. We should be working together to increase accountability. We should be protecting taxpayer investments. We should be opening the door to higher education. Instead, we're debating this wasteful, partisan piece of legislation. I urge all members vote no.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Austria.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, and I thank the chairwoman for her hard work on this bill. And a year ago, I spoke on the House floor urging this committee to introduce legislation repealing the program integrity regulations. Today, I speak in support of H.R. 2117, which will repeal 2 of these regulations. While we must ensure that a small number of schools who have acted in bad faith are dealt with accordingly, the credit hour and state licensing regulations are an overreaction with vast unintended consequences. First, these regulations will significantly alter the federal role in the accrediting and licensing institutions of higher education. Second, they will also drastically limit student access to educational programs and negatively impact all schools. Let me give you an example of a school located in the Midwest in my district, Ohio Christian University. It's an example of a school that will be adversely affected by these regulations. OCU is located in Pickaway County, which is a typical county in southeastern Ohio and mirrors that of many across the Midwest, which is struggling with its difficult economy, which has lost over 2,500 jobs, and only 11% of the residents in this county have a bachelor's degree. In contrast, Ohio Christian University has created 150 jobs in just 5 years while graduating thousands of students since its founding in 1948. In addition to offering traditional undergraduate degrees, OCU offers an online degree program. Currently, more than 1,000 students from over 15 states are enrolled in that program. Because of the high costs and administrative burdens required to get licensing in every state where an online student resides, OCU will be forced to unenroll at least half of its online students and lay off a large number of staff. Further, as part of the adult degree program, OCU offers a limited number of credit hours for prior learning and work experiences. This program allows non-traditional students the ability to return to school and earn their degree. To comply with the credit hour regulation, the university will be forced to eliminate that program, which would be a significant disincentive for older students. The regulation will also negatively impact traditional students by setting a strict definition of credit hour. This will eliminate the school's ability to credit innovative courses which provide students with the cutting-edge skills and knowledge required for future employees. So today I urge my colleagues to protect our schools, states, and students from these burdensome, overreaching regulations by supporting H.R. 2117, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr.
Gentleman from Ohio is
committee.
recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2117, the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act. This legislation would remove critical safeguards against ensuring that American taxpayer dollars are used responsibly in our higher education system. For example, unregulated for-profit colleges are targeting our veterans, targeting low-income students, and targeting minorities. These institutions receive a high percentage of their revenue from federal student loan dollars, yet they're failing to properly educate their students. As a result, the students who need the most support are failing to get it. They're more likely to drop out, graduate without a degree, and without proper training they need to obtain gainful employment. And in turn, they're unable to pay back their student loan debt. H.R. 2117 would let the for-profit colleges off the hook. We must start focusing our efforts on making college more affordable for all students. We must stop the interest rates from doubling on student loans and provide for innovative ways to help students pay back their loans rather than condemning them to early lives of debt. We need to increase the maximum Pell Grant and broaden the eligibility for them. We need to invest in programs at community colleges that train students to enter into our workforce. We need to refocus our attention on assisting young Americans to obtain the education they need and deserve instead of repealing regulations that protect our investment in their future. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield two minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Laurel.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this legislation, which will enable even more fraud and abuse in the for-profit college industry. Right now, many for-profit colleges are engaged in the same sorts of predatory lending schemes that we saw in the housing market. And according to Holly Petraeus at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, recruiters from for-profit colleges have been signing up Marines with serious brain injuries, Marines who cannot even remember what they signed up for in order to inflate their profits. And according to a 2009 Pew study, even though only 1 in 14 students, or 7%, attend these proprietary schools, they make up nearly half, 44% of the default rate on student loans. So, if anything, we need more comprehensive oversight over for-profit colleges. Instead, this bill repeals regulations that are already on the books to make it easier for the institutions to commit fraud at the expense of students and taxpayers. The bill does is overturns regulations for awarding federal student aid that are aimed at ensuring accountability and reducing fraud. It removes the ability of the Secretary of Education to find a credit hour without providing an alternative. It removes the federal government's ability to protect students from being overcharged and ultimately overcome by costly student loans. And by getting rid of the state authorization requirement, it opens the door to billions of taxpayers' dollars going to institutions that are openly flouting the law. It's about manipulating credit hours in order to receive more federal aid. Instead of deregulating for-profit colleges, we should be working to ensure that these institutions are fulfilling their obligations to their students. We should work to fix the real problems that students face right now: growing student debt and the upcoming interest rate increase on student loans. This bill will only cause more fraud and abuse in a sector that is already rife with it, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. And yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would like to point out that this bill, again, has bipartisan support. We have a letter from the National Governors Association which talks about the need to strengthen higher education, not give more federal control, and a letter from the American Council on Education signed by Molly Corbett Broad and 98 institutions from across the country, mostly public and private institutions. This is not a for-profit or a public issue. This is all institutions of higher education who are concerned with this issue. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California.
You 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2117, the Protecting Freedom in Higher Education Act. This legislation will simply wipe out all of the credit hour and state authorization program integrity rules. These rules are so important and crucial because this is what prevents the widespread ripoff, fraud, and abuse in this industry. H.R. 2117 would repeal the Department of Education's state authorization regulation, which gives states the ability to enforce their right to require that all colleges operating within their jurisdictions be authorized to do so. Without the state authorization rule, states have no way of knowing which colleges operate within their states unless they operate on physical campuses. The state authorization rule simply requires that as a condition for receipt of federal aid, colleges verify that they have authorization from the states in which they operate and are in adherence to their state education laws. This legislation also aims to overturn the rule creating a sweeping federal definition of credit hour. Currently, there's no common understanding of what colleges mean when they use the word credit. The most egregious result of this provision's repeal is the abuses of for-profit colleges like the American Intercontinental University, who has been charged with inflating their credit hours to a point where they offered 9 college credits for courses that were only 5 weeks long. The federal definition of a credit hour is imperative to directly address colleges that have been inflating their credits to acquire more federal student financial aid dollars. This rule will also help mitigate the widespread problems students face in transferring credits from one institution to another by articulating a more precise measure of educational concept attainment represented by credits a student earned. The program integrity rules have been put in place to ensure that all students receive a fair shake in their quest to obtain a higher education. Instead of working against the Department of Education and Secretary Duncan, policymakers should be working with them to implement these rules in a sensible way, not trying to repeal them altogether. Ladies and gentlemen, what is happening with private post-secondary schools is the next biggest scandal. You think the subprime meltdown was big when American taxpayers find out how much of their tax dollars are being ripped off by these private post-secondary schools who have the Joe Blow school for computer learning with no computers, teachers who are not accredited, credit hours that are distorted, and students who don't get trained, don't get education, can't transfer anything, and end up with a lot of debt. I ask you to please reject this legislation. I have the greatest respect for the legislator who's introduced this, but this is wrong. This is a ripoff, and we should be against it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate the comment of my colleague from California, and I'll continue to reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California.
We have no further speakers, Madam Chair, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would just conclude that I think when you consider the $200 billion that the taxpayers of this country provide through the federal government student aid programs to the institutions of higher education all across the country, all of different dynamics, that before we throw out what modest accounting system we have for trying to make sure that we buy value for each and every student who spends their money, the money that they borrow, the money that their parents borrow, to try to provide them the educational opportunity so that they can participate in the greater American opportunity all across this country. We ought not to be throwing this system out. As Mr. Bishop pointed out, this is a minimum requirement. It's a requirement that many people will recognize. When you sign up for a 3-unit course, very often you find out you're spending 3 hours a week in that class. If you sign up for a 5-hour course, you're spending more time. The question really becomes now, as we see a lot of different institutions mixing in to this space and receiving and living off almost 85 to 90% of their revenues come from the federal taxpayers. Do these courses really have value? Are they giving the student the value for which they're signing up? The record is replete that in many instances that's not the case, that in many instances the students have been defrauded. In many instances they were represented that this is all transferable to the state colleges or to the university systems when in fact it turned out not to be true. And I think that we ought to make sure that we don't throw out that current accounting system to make sure that taxpayers and students are getting value for the money that they spend and the money that they work hard to pay back at a time when we have nothing to take its place. And the idea now that in the future you need no accreditation in a state to start up an institution and then you have access to all of the revenues you can grab from the federal government makes no sense for me at all. That we ought to have accountability in this system, and that accountability runs to the students and it runs to the taxpayers in this country. I would hope that we would reject this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield myself the remainder of my time.
Gentlewoman is recognized for up to 12 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. No one in this body believes more in accountability than I do. However, increasing federal control over our lives and over institutions of higher education is not the way to go. As Jefferson said, and I paraphrase, if we allow Washington to tell us when to sow and when to reap, we should soon want bread. In order to make post-secondary education more affordable and accessible for students, we need to encourage innovation on our college campuses and allow institution leaders to develop and implement their own solutions to drive down the cost for students. However, this cannot happen if the federal government continues to attempt to micromanage our higher education system by imposing more regulations. The Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act repeals 2 onerous regulations that give the federal government unnecessary control over the academic affairs of colleges and universities. H.R. 2117 will ensure institutions can continue to develop innovative programs and course options to meet students' needs. We have letters of support from colleges, Higher Education Association, the National Governors Association on this legislation. When the Education and the Workforce Committee held a markup of H.R. 2117 last summer, I was also pleased to have the support of many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I hope we can continue to work together by approving this legislation to help students in colleges. I strongly urge my colleagues to support the Protecting Academic Freedom in Higher Education Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in the bill shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No amendment to the committee amendment is in order except those printed in House Report 112-404. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It's now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in House Report 112-404. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona rise?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 112-404, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Report 563, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The bill we are debating today, H.R. 2117, eliminates the entire state authorization rule, including the establishment of a process for states to review and appropriately act on student complaints concerning an institution. This amendment would make sure that those student complaints provisions are retained. Up until now, in many states, a student who discovers that the program she is enrolled in is not providing the preparation she paid for, or is not preparing in a way that they suggested, or has treated her unfairly, would have little recourse in the way of a complaint. Not all states have a complaint process in place, but these recently implemented rules established a state-based process for students to lodge a complaint. This provision is a good idea. This process will help to shine light on programs and give students and families an opportunity for recourse when they feel they have been misled or mistreated by an institution or a program. The vast majority of institutions work in the students' best interests and will seek to guide students and address concerns when they arise. The amendment ensures that students have a place to air their concerns when that is not the case. I think we should maintain the student protecting provision in the regulations by removing the provision that eliminates it in this bill. My amendments protect students and taxpayers by ensuring that each state has a process in place to receive and review student complaints, and by promoting good practices and addressing abuses. Last Congress, we worked hard to protect consumers from bad practices at credit companies and banks. We should do the same for students. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
He can't do that, can he? The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Does the gentlewoman from North Carolina rise in opposition?
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Under the Higher Education Act, accrediting agencies are already required to have a system for individuals to give complaints about a college or university. Under current practice, many states have well-established complaint processes that are serving students. I'm also concerned about the burden this regulation will place on states. While the economic situation in our country has shown modest improvements recently, states are struggling with huge budgetary challenges. They have limited staff and may not be able to handle new and unnecessary changes required under this proposal. During a time when states, institutions, parents, and students are worried about ways to increase college affordability, I think it would be better for states to put their limited resources toward helping colleges and universities keep their tuition down rather than adding another layer of state bureaucracy. For these reasons and others,